会にあたり主催
At the outset, on behalf of the sponsor of the symposium, President Yoshiji Nogami of the Japan Institute of International Affairs would give a welcoming remark. President Nogami, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us in this Symposium History organized by JIIA. Some of you have participated in the various meetings we have organized from March this year with a view to tackling the historical issues in various ways. So we have organized various symposia and meetings. And this symposium is a part of the series of efforts we have been making. And the theme here is history and reconciliation, participated by the members from various countries. History issue is a difficult issue because each one has various views of one's own. And so on our part, with the participation of the members not only from Japan but from various other countries in the world, and to see how the views will match or be compared or contrasted, to see what we can do out of that. And we have a plan of continuing with this kind of symposia for coming 5 years. And through such process, we would wish to achieve the deepening of understanding and awareness about history and historical issues. We have the schedule for the whole day, rather packed timetable, but this is the occasion to learn from various views from various participants so that we can make this gathering the most fruitful and significant one. It is a rather long day, and we handle a very serious issues, but we like to invite your active participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Nogami. Now we would like to move on to a keynote speech. Would Dr. Kitaoka come up to the stage, please? Let me introduce the keynote speaker. The speaker is Dr. Shinichi Kitaoka, President of JICA. Dr. Kitaoka is specialized in modern Japanese politics and diplomacy. After being a member of the faculty of Rikyo University and the University of Tokyo, from 2004 to 2006, he has served as the Deputy Permanent Representative of Japan to the United Nations. He had also served as the chair for the Sino-Japanese Joint History Research Committee and Council on Reconstruction of Legal Foundation for Security, and also he has been the acting chair of the advisory panel on the history of the 20th century and on Japan's role and world order in the 21st century.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. As I was introduced, my name is Kitaoka. My current position is the President of Japan International Cooperation Agency, specializing in ODA. But the years I studied history is much longer than being serving as the President of JICA. And in 2015, I was involved in the preparatory works, preparing for the Prime Minister Abe's statement commemorating the 70th anniversary of the end of war. And I was a member of the preparatory committee, and we wanted to continue with such efforts. And this is underneath our efforts here. And as a keynote speech, I should like to make the various presentations of the points and issues regarding history and reconciliation, not the answers, no solutions, but topics for your discussion. As the outline shows, there have been wars in various eras. When the war started, there should be a conclusion to that. There have been some rare cases of annihilation of the counterpart, but usually it's not the case. When the war is over, there are three acts taken. One is to handle the territorial issues, and then the second is the post-war reparations, and then the punishment of those responsible. These are the three items. And way of ending the war, the soft peace, that is the tolerant ending, and the other would be hard peace. Soft peace, the representative case may be the Vienna regime to deal with the confusion after the Napoleonic War, and not rather than punishing the France, but try to restore the pre-Napoleonic regime. And what happened was that led to a longer peace. And the representative case of hard peace would be the First World War. Not on territorial issues, but a very severe reparations demands were imposed. Reparations means the flow of money. There is a limit whether there is economic possibility or not. A huge sum of reparations imposed on Germany, and Germany could not pay that, and as a reaction to that, there was a rise of Nazism. That was foreseen by many at the time. The Keynes said that the order could not be maintained if such huge reparations are imposed. And there was in his book the case of peace payment, and that led to the Second World War. And Second World War may be a case of soft peace on the West side, and not necessarily between the Soviet Union and other parties. And so the soft peace lasts longer and not the hard peace. But we cannot simply decide war and peace, who should be acting such and such. And there is inevitably a sense of dissatisfaction, and that may lead to another conflict. And so the second point. What are the issues for the diplomacy? Classically, the high politics, war, peace, territory. Those were the main issues for diplomacy, but we no longer see outright wars in post-war era. The biggest reason is that the cost of war is too high. And the damage, think of damage incurred by wars, better not engage in wars. So from 1945, in post-war era, there have not been any major wars among the major countries. So it's the unprecedented longer period of peace in the world history. And what happened would be the emergence of the economy. Such as a tariffs, trade, or quota. There are some conflicts involving such economic issues. Well, the opening of Japan stems from whether to open the country or not, and the Opium War in China, again, had to do with the economic or trade issues. But after the World War II, with the establishment of GATT and the WTO in 1990s, so the conflict resolution has been institutionalized and made into rules. So a less number of conflicts as such. And then the major issue of diplomacy instead became the image or identity, such and such first, or self-centered such and such first issue. That is a self-assertion, in turn undermining the counterparty's images. And enhancing the image of oneself and to undermine the images of others. Becoming the central part of diplomacy, there has not been institutionalization of such. So, in fact, the fruits of a long-lasting soft peace in post-war era have been crumbled because of image contestation. And as point 3 points out, looking at the colony and control of colonies, the size of damage and the investment the colonial power made, and the remaining dissatisfaction and complaints are not directly related. And there will be report on the Indian case. For instance, in case of United Kingdom, France, or in case of United Kingdom, their relationship with the former colonies are relatively good. Although there are issues, it's not that the UK did all the good things. We think of various conflicts that are currently going on now, like South Sudan or Myanmar, maybe originates from what United Kingdom did in the past as a root. And the same applies to the Middle East. But relatively speaking, the degree of complaint and dissatisfaction against the UK is not that high. And the same applies to France. And France mobilized the troops from former colonies in their fight against Germany because their population was not enough. In the United States, I was taking taxi, and I was talking with the driver, and he said his father came from Senegal, and his father fought in Indochina for on the French side, fighting against the independence. And also in Algeria, there were considerable victims, but the relationship with France and the former colonies, not that bad. But what about the case in Japan? When we compare the Japanese control of Taiwan and control of Korea, about the number of victims, probably the same. Very similar, not exact, but the feelings vis-a-vis Japan in Taiwan at the moment is relatively good, but there were considerable killing and atrocities in Taiwan at the time, and the considerable victims and suffering, whereas in case of Korea, it's hard to put it, but the number of victims is not that large. In other words, the resistance against the Japanese control initially was much stronger in Taiwan, and the greater degree of victims. But the outcome we see now is very different. And looking around in Asia, the case of the Philippines, American rule of the Philippines. Well, somebody may refer to this, but the history is written by the victors, and in the context of American history book, the American control of the Philippines was favorable. But nowadays, people start talking about it's not that good. And there was the independence campaign, and after the war with Spain, the U.S. came to control the Philippines, and the number of those died in the Philippines, about 200,000. And in case of Korea, those victimized was 50,000. So it's not a matter of number. And the Philippines is pro the United States more. And the degree of damage, what colonizers brought to the colony. Well, when I visited Congo for the first time, DRC, Congo Democratic Republic, and Belgium was the colonizer, no railway implemented. There was only railway connecting diamond mines to the port. No schools, no hospitals. Well, for the fairness, it's not that there's none, but in Belgium, churches were the main players, as the stories of Nun, the movie, described. So the churches organized schools, but not the school, hospitals, and the railways Japan tried to implement in Taiwan or Korea. But it's not the DRC people do not hold so much grudge against Belgium, maybe. So there is not direct relationship with the size of damage and reconciliation. Of course, I have to say that colonization is not good, it's bad. But it's a matter of worse or relatively less worse. So it's, in the main, it's not good. So I'm not saying that some goods were brought about, but what I'm saying is that the size of damage and the lingering feeling against it afterwards are not directly related. And the fourth point, the one factor for reconciliation would be the size of shared interest in realistic terms. During the Cold War, the conflicts against the USSR, that was the major basis for the reconciliation between the United States and Germany and the United States and Japan. With that, a strong common interest in realistic terms, the former feud was set aside. So that is one major conditions for reconciliation.
体制の問題であります。
Now, about the political system and reconciliation. Is the political system a liberal system or is it a totalitarian system? Well, of course, there would be variability in terms of the liberal system, but the reconciliation had advanced between Germany and Poland because there was this freedom or this room of liberty in the political system that was introduced into Poland. Now, what would the historical event be described in the school textbooks that can be controlled and censored by the government, and the speech can be suppressed by the government? And so in the modern history, for example, in China, in the bus that connects the airplane and the terminal, there would be some military songs that would be played just until recently. And the former Manchuria are basically pro-Japanese, and that is the Jiang'an province. And so this is the former Manchurian region, and about half of the Japanese researchers have been born in this area. And so the rule of Japan, the reality of the rule of Japan back then are still memorized by quite a few people. And when it goes to Chongqing, people would only have a memory of great suffering under the Japanese rule. So there is this great variability in how people remember Japan and its rule in China. And oftentimes, of course, people in this country would criticize Japan harshly. But at one time, there were very pro-Japanese. In 1992, the Emperor and the Empress had visited China. And of course, as a basic rule of the imperial family, they would not visit countries that have some potential dispute with Japan, so they didn't go to South Korea and Russia, but the Imperial Household Agency considered China to be a safe country. And so there was this appreciation for the support of Japan, and also reference to Japan in the textbooks of the schools in China. And so the basic treaty being concluded between Japan and China. And also recently in Japan, there was this visit by Jiang Zemin, and when Jiang Zemin visited Japan, he was quite critical, but upon reflection, I come to evaluate his statement to be relatively moderate. So time would heal the pain of history. Now, about Russia, which was also a totalitarian country. Russia is now a military power, but they have relative freedom of speech, and they have disclosed these documents, and Yeltsin had expressed his apologies of the Japanese POW that were detained in Siberia. So whether or not there is freedom of speech is very critical for reconciliation. Now, what about South Korea? They are not a totalitarian country, that's my view. However, several elements that constitute democracy are different, especially the rule of law. The major factor involved in the rule of law is that the responsibility lies with the individual, not the group of people. And also the statute of limitation. So in Korea, for certain incidents or conducts, it is not an individual responsibility, but there is the statute of limitation and also collective liability or collective responsibility that will be questioned. And of course, the freedom of speech would come before even the freedom of learning. But when it comes to history, it is not necessarily the case in South Korea. Well, with democratization taking deep root in the society, maybe things would change, but at the moment I am not sure. Now, going on to number 6. What about the cultural factors involved in reconciliation? This is also important, and Catholics seems to be more generous compared to the Protestants. In the European countries, in the world of Christianity, UK, the Netherlands are quite harsh, and also the United States, that are quite critical to Japan, whereas the originally Catholic countries, including the Philippines, can condone and forgiveness. And what is very difficult is Confucianism. They have this very strict sense of right and wrong. And in China, there is this generation of dynasties. And this new dynasty being born would be described and communicated by the historians, and how they are legitimate and how they were really destined to be born. And so once it is described as a story by the historian, the dynasty would be a given. And so this is a different story from the freedom of speech. In Japan, Confucianism had been believed by many people in Japan, and Okitsugu Tamura during the Edo period had been criticized by his deeds. And if Confucianism is recognized as a religion, it is to clarify what is wrong and what is evil. And Buddhism, I believe, have other elements involved, and I don't really know what Islam is all about. And this Buddhism has a stronger sense of forgiveness. Now, responsibility and apology. How would they be related? So, a very famous speech given by Weizsäcker says that responsibility ultimately lies with the individual. It is not the collective responsibility that is to be questioned. So, in this pre-World War II Japan aggression and invasion, there were, of course, people who could not make a decision, although there was this information like Fumimaro Konoe and other civilian people in the government. And so those people who didn't have information and supported the government, and those who had information but could not really stop the conduct, have different levels of responsibility. And so Class B and Class C war criminals have this difference of how much information they had. And I believe ultimately the individual responsibility is more important over this collective responsibility. But I'm not saying that there is no collective responsibility whatsoever. The entire system being established that led to war, or for example, people who enjoy prosperity. Of course, as a result of the war ending, Japan enjoys prosperity. And so there is this collective responsibility that is involved, and I have drafted this document that ultimately became the statement by Prime Minister Abe commemorating the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. And one responsibility that we have not clarified and taken is to learn history, this accurate and precise history. What led us to such a situation in, for example, China and in the region surrounding Japan and World War II? Now, what about the responsibility of the emperor? Of course, externally, from the eyes of the world, maybe he has some responsibility that he had to take. However, according to the Japanese law, he was not to be pursued of his responsibility. But what happened if the emperor was punished or he had to abdicate? Probably if he stepped down from the throne, there was a major confusion. And because the crown prince was still young, if he stepped down from the throne right after World War II, and there had to be this regent that had to be appointed. And so I believe the emperor had taken his responsibility to take the initiative to bring the war to an end. And so it is really short-sighted to pursue this responsibility of the emperor. Now, number 8 has to do with mourning and reconciliation. So Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima. So President Obama did not apologize, nor Prime Minister Abe. And I think this is okay. However, many in the United States really take up Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima altogether, that there was this Pearl Harbor attack by the Japanese military forces, so there was this Hiroshima A-bomb drop. And they're totally different. That was the Pearl Harbor attack was before the official start of the World War II, but the military bases should have been fully prepared for a sudden surprise attack. And of course, we are very sorry for the great toll that the American soldiers had taken, and the actual was mainly the civilians. So there was this mass slaughter of civilians in Hiroshima, whereas the major victims in Pearl Harbor was the military personnel. This is really a major difference. And also 100,000 people had died in the air raid over the city of Tokyo during World War II. And so the U.S. Air Forces had dropped numerous bombs over the city of Tokyo, and many people had died, 100,000. So there is this mourning, but I don't think it's that with these apologies expressed by the top leaders of Japan and U.S. that we are to take these everything as things in the past and we can forget. That is not the right thing to do. But in order to reconcile, we have to have this correct understanding of history. We cannot really reconcile by making a compromise, accepting those fallacies. Now, I have been involved in the history, the study of history, and I believe that one of the major joint history research event was the Lake Kawaguchi conference that gathered major historians from the United States and Japan to really study what should have been done to avoid the war getting started. And the Japanese historians would consider what Japan should have done, and the American historians and scholars considered what Americans should have done to avoid war. And so this is really pure academic research, and political intervention was not there. And this Sino-Japanese joint history study was very difficult. I served as the chair of that committee, and we have taken up the so-called parallel history, the view of Japan on a certain event and the view of China on a certain event to be compared as parallel history. And of course, if there are misunderstandings, the other side can make a correction. But try to, first of all, deepen the understanding of the perception of the other side. And of course, we were not able to fully fill out the gap, and especially the post-war So the post-war discourse was not fully agreed upon, and China had denied publication. However, there was this recommendation made that how things are taught, the same events are taught in China, and how Japan is being teaching the event here in this country can be described in supplementary school textbooks. And what I wanted to do really was to have the participation of a scholar from a third country. So when we had this joint history research council, the Chinese counterpart said that they want to just think about the Sino-Japanese relationship and the event that took place between the two countries. But I think it is important, for example, to think about what happened between China and Korea, or Korea and Japan, and the involvement of a third-party country would be very important to facilitate our understanding. And also, this multinational joint research of history, to have the participation of scholars from as many countries as possible is quite important. So to be objective is very difficult, according to Pearl Copper. And so it's not to be objective, but to be anti-subjective. That was a suggestion that was made. And anyway, if participation of scholars and historians from various countries in the world can pursue history jointly to promote reconciliation, I think that would be ideal. And I'm sorry I didn't suggest any solutions to the challenges in front of us, but I believe some of the points that I made would be food for thought in this symposium. Thank you.
いました。
Thank you very much. Now, we would like to start the part one, the first panel discussion. And this part takes the case studies on reconciliation. There are 4 panelists moderated by President of JIIA, Ambassador Nogami. And the moderator and panelists for part 1, please come up to the stage. I should like to introduce the panelists to you. The first panelist from India, the Dr. Brahmacharani of the Center for Policy Research, specializing in international security and arms control. Next to him is Dr. Lily Feldman, Senior Fellow of American Institute for Contemporary German Studies of Johns Hopkins University. She specializes in international reconciliation and German foreign policy. And next to her is Dr. Fumiaki Kubo, professor of the University of Tokyo. He specializes in American politics and American diplomacy. And next to him is Mr. Nobukatsu Kanehara, Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary and Deputy Secretary General, National Security Secretariat. Mr. Kanehara joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan in 1981 and served in various positions such as a minister, the Deputy Secretary General of the Cabinet Intelligence and Research Office and the Director General of the International Legal Affairs Bureau of MOFA. So, President Nogami, please. As Professor Kitaoka mentioned in his keynote speech, there have been various cases of history and reconciliation in the past, and there have been cases of soft peace as well as hard peace. And based on the points he made, in this part 1, we should like to take up various individual cases of reconciliation and to look into the factors behind a relatively successful reconciliation, or some factors hindering the reconciliation. Towards the end, Dr. Kitaoka point to the need of making the joint study multinational. So from such a point of view, we like to shed light on this aspect from a point of view of various countries. And I should like to ask each panelist to talk for about 15 minutes in the initial round, followed by the discussion and the Q&A among the panelists, followed by Q&A involving the audience. So, as Professor Kitaoka mentioned, the case of India and the United Kingdom, we have Dr. Chalani from India, please.
Ambassador Nogami, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, as you heard the chair mention that I've been asked to focus on the British-India relationship. But let me begin a bit more broadly. One cannot change history, but one can learn from history. History tends to greatly influence national perceptions and perspectives, and often acts as a major impediment to reconciliation between countries. Yet, history is rarely an objective chronicle. Objective history actually is an oxymoron. It is not uncommon for nations to create sanitized, self-serving historical narratives. In fact, many countries blend historical fact with fiction. As George Orwell famously said, "Who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past." The boundary between historical fiction and non-fiction is usually more porous than the students of history might think. While historical revisionism is prevalent among democracies, autocracies tend to have a monopoly on history and its interpretation. Therefore, rewriting history is a major state project in autocracies. Take China. The Chinese Communist Party, by embellishing or distorting China's past, seeks to make real the central legend driving Chinese foreign policy. And the legend is China's centrality in the world. There is another important aspect about history, the one that Dr. Kitaoka underscored, which is that history is written by the winners, by the victors of a major war. Consequently, Japan, for example, as a nation vanquished in World War II, faces pressure to this day to make amends for its colonial wrongs. There is no similar pressure on Britain, France, and other colonial powers that emerged victorious in World War II. Their colonial crimes, as well as the crimes in World War II, have been whitewashed or simply forgotten. It is in this context that one must view India's relationship with its former colonial ruler, Britain. Britain originally came to India as a trading company, the East India Company, and then gradually, over a period of 1 century, increased its toehold into a foothold before extending its hold across much of the subcontinent of India. The British elevated the strategy of divide and rule into an art. When the British gained a toehold in India, Britain was a poor country, but it had maritime capability. By contrast, India at that time was one of the richest lands in the world, yet it had neglected its traditions of maritime power. That is why India got colonized. At the beginning of the 19th century, according to a study by the British economist Angus Madison, India alone accounted for 23% of the global GDP. British rule, however, through loot and plunder, turned India into one of the poorest lands. By the time the British left, India's share of the global economy had sunk from nearly a quarter to less than 4%, to be precise, 3.8%. The term concentration camps is usually associated with the Nazis. In reality, the term became known because of the British, who during the Boer War in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century established mass concentration camps. 1/6 of the Boer population, mainly women and children, died in the British established concentration camps. Britain's brutal practices in India extended from concentration camps to man-made famines, punitive expeditions, and scorched earth policies. To give you one example, the man-made Madras and Bengal famines killed millions of Indians. Winston Churchill, by diverting Indian resources in support of the British World War II effort, not only presided over the hideous Bengal famine, but also publicly mocked the Indian suffering, declaring that the culling of the Indian population by the famine was good news. He said that in public. In truth, Churchill was no different than Adolf Hitler. But because Churchill was on the side that won World War II, the blood on his hands didn't matter in the final analysis because the victor's historical narrative prevailed globally. Against this background, the big question you might have in mind: has Britain ever apologized to India for its brutal rule? The answer is no. They have never apologized. You might be surprised to learn that India, in fact, has never demanded an apology from Britain. So why would Britain apologize when India hasn't asked for an apology? An apology, in any case, cannot correct historical wrongs or even assuage national feelings. Look no further than East Asia, where repeated Japanese apologies have proved insufficient to promote genuine reconciliation in this part of the world. The fact is that India decided long ago to move on. And unlike, say, South Korea, which has sought to eliminate the last vestiges of Japanese rule, India has never attempted to remove the signs of British rule. India is, of course, not the only country which has not tried to remove signs of foreign colonial rule. Taiwan is also another example in that category. Whether it's India's strength or India's weakness, the simple fact is that India decided long ago not to hold a grudge against Britain. Rather than look back, India decided to look ahead. But there are two key points that you should bear in mind. One, Britain has never, ever acknowledged its crimes in India. Nor has Britain ever been willing, to this day, to return some of the loot, some of the treasures it looted from India, and which now adorn British museums. To give you just one small example, the stolen Kohinoor diamond, one of the world's largest, adorns the British crown jewels. Another point. Unlike, say, the relationship between Germany and Poland that Dr. Feldman is going to talk about, a relationship where reconciliation happened through an extended process, there has never been a process of reconciliation between Britain and India. India has reconciled with Britain without any process. Imagine if China or South Korea had been in India's place. The world would have heard strident attacks on an unrepentant Britain on a regular basis to this day. Now, what factors explain the Indian tolerance, especially when you contrast that with the fact that China still harps on the colonial ravages it suffered, while South Korea is prone to dredge up historical grievances? The answer lies in political, educational, and cultural factors that are India-specific. Let's consider the political factor first. In some Asian countries, a historical consciousness has been deliberately cultivated and harnessed for negative political reasons. History is being used in a cynical way to keep the flames of hatred alive. In India, there has never been such an effort, in large part because India, since independence, has been a genuine democracy. Had India come under extended autocratic rule right after independence, let's say for about 25-30 years, a different kind of historical narrative could have emerged by political design. Now consider the educational factor. An educational system, if structured in a particular way, can resurrect the ghosts of history. On the other hand, an educational system that is forward-looking can help a country step out of the shadows of history. There has not been a single educational system in India since independence. There have been many different types of educational systems in India. Each state in India has at least one educational system. Some Indian states have multiple educational systems. And under the Indian Constitution, education is a state-level responsibility, not a federal-level responsibility. So in this fragmented structure, there hasn't been much room for the federal government to politicize history. Cultural factors are also an important explanation. And I will, for brevity's sake, and because my time is about to finish, I'll just touch on one cultural factor. In India, the principle of karma is deeply embedded in social philosophy. Karma translates loosely as destiny or fate. Some countries, as you know, especially in the Middle East, are trapped in a vicious cycle of retribution. Retribution goes on for generations and even centuries. But there is no place for retribution in karma. Karma actually encourages individuals and communities to look ahead, not to look back. So these various India-centric factors have contributed to India reconciling with Britain. This suggests that domestic factors, even if they are one-sided, that domestic factors are paramount in promoting reconciliation between two countries. Unfortunately, in some parts of Asia, the resurrection of historical grievances and disputes has helped strengthen the shackles of the past. To break the shackles of the past, we must heed the wisdom of a Russian proverb, which says, forget the past and lose one eye, dwell on the past and lose both eyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Charani. Now I would like to ask Professor Feldman to speak for about 15 minutes. Her specialty is Germany. So I think we can hear about the German case. Please.
Let me start by thanking the Japanese Institute of International Affairs for this very generous invitation to be here today, and to thank all of you for attending. The title of my presentation is The German-Polish Path to Reconciliation, Steep but Successful. And I'd like to do three things in the short time that I have. One is to make some introductory remarks. I'd then like to briefly give you the trajectory of German-Polish relations from 1945 until today. And then I'd like to talk about what I call the 10 principles of reconciliation, and give you some Polish examples. There are 10 principles, and I think I have a minute per principle, so I hope I can stick to that. The first thing I'd like to mention is Willy Brandt's characterization of relations between Germany and Poland. He said it was a reconciliation process requiring careful spade work. In other words, it takes energy and creativity to cultivate a flourishing garden. The second introductory remark is that the German-Polish relationship has been built on the Franco-German model. Both Polish and German leaders have referred to this over many years. That is always the model they have in mind, both in spirit but also in institutional design. The third thing I'd like to do is to define reconciliation. We use the term a lot, but we rarely define what we mean. We often mean different things. By reconciliation, I mean the process of building long-term peace between former enemies through bilateral institutions across governments and societies. Reconciliation involves the development of friendship, trust, empathy, magnanimity, not necessarily forgiveness. Reconciliation is not an easily approached terminal condition, but rather an ongoing, lengthy, non-linear, messy process. This is the maximal definition of reconciliation that is different from the minimal definition of peaceful coexistence or the absence of war. As to the overall trajectory of relations, I would suggest there are 6 discernible periods between 1945 and today. The first 2 decades after the end of World War II, when it was a situation of mutual non-recognition. Then from 1970 until 1989, from the 1970 Normalization Treaty, which institutionalized a certain set of relations, through to the end of communism. In this period, there was the first development of the beginnings of reconciliation, and I want to emphasize that because at the time, Poland was a communist country. So it is possible to have the beginnings, not the full flowering, but the beginnings of reconciliation between a liberal society and a communist one. The third period is from 1989, after the end of communism, through 2000, the so-called golden age of German-Polish relations, in which many institutions were developed, and friendship also. Then from 2000 to 2007, the relationship was tested by significant differences between the two countries, but it met the challenge, and I want to emphasize that it met the challenge. 2007 to 2015, Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Tusk reinvigorated the institutionalization of relations, and also developed even further examples of friendship and a closer partnership. And then 2015 until now, differences appear, and I put the emphasis on appear, differences appear to outweigh the positive dimension of relations. The key question is whether this current period is a temporary problem in an otherwise solid process of reconciliation, or whether it actually means a permanent movement away from reconciliation. I would suggest that if we take a panoramic view of German-Polish relations, rather than a snapshot, we could understand that this might be a temporary difficulty in relations, but not a permanent one. Let me come to the 10 principles of reconciliation. The first principle, reconciliation does not suggest harmony, but rather contains and manages disagreement and contention in a cooperative framework. And to give you the example, if one were to look at the headlines today, one would imagine that German-Polish relations are fraying. Many Polish politicians, including the Prime Minister, have demanded reparations from Germany for the damage that it did to Poland during World War II. At the same time as these differences, however, there are also positive signs. There's a new joint agreement for institutions in science and technology between the two countries. When there have been differences in the past, and there have been many, the crises were resolved by dialogue and deliberation through one of two means, either through well-established bureaucratic channels or through leadership connections. Just one example, the head of Poland's governing party today, about a year ago, made a secret trip to Chancellor Merkel's retreat to talk about the difficulties. And often this has happened. There's a lot of talk behind the scenes. At the top, we see difficulty. Behind the scenes, we see a willingness to compromise. The second principle, reconciliation is driven by a combination of moral and pragmatic motivations. For Germany, it was a moral obligation to make up for what Poland had lost, first through Nazism and then through communism. Pragmatically, with Poland and reconciliation, Germany felt it had stability to its east. Through reconciliation, Polish leaders saw the manifestation of the moral Polish ideal of nationhood that had been denied it so long by Germany. Pragmatically, for Poland, partnership with Germany meant an avenue to membership in NATO and the European Union. The third principle, early on, Germany acknowledged the crimes it had committed during World War II and it recognized its victims' suffering. The 1970 German-Polish Normalization Treaty referred to Poland as the first victim of a murderous war, and many, many times thereafter, similar statements have been made where there has been an acknowledgement of what Germany did in great detail. Recently, in spring 2017, if you looked at the website of the German Foreign Office, you would see it says the basis of the relationship, the very basis of the relationship, is Germany's responsibility for confronting the past and for acknowledging the plight of its victims. There was also recognition by Germany of the western border between Germany and Poland already in 1970 de facto, but then not until unification de jure as a matter of international law. So territorial issues can be there, not dealt with completely, and in the end can be addressed, but it can take a very long time. The fourth principle, civil society actors in both Germany and the partner countries often were the catalysts for reconciliation, initiating a process that governments then joined, solidified, expanded, and funded. Just to give you an example, there were sporadic religious connections between Germany and Poland already in the 1950s, but the breakthrough came in 1965 when the Polish bishops invited the German bishops to the celebration of the millennial of Christianity in Poland. They asked Germany for forgiveness for the brutality of the expulsion of Germans from what became Polish territory after World War II. They asked for forgiveness, but they also granted forgiveness to Germany. I'd also like to make the point that the victims often take the first initiative when we're looking at civil society, not necessarily the perpetrators. The fifth principle, reconciliation requires political leadership and vision that can negotiate the inevitable opposition to reconciliation. There is always domestically opposition to reconciliation, but leaders with vision, with moral courage, are able to encounter those difficulties, come up with arguments to try to disprove the points they have. The key development in relations is that these personal tandems are developed, personal duos. To give you some examples, between Schmidt and Gierek, between von Weizsäcker and Mazowiecki, between Merkel and Tusk, between Steinmeier, the foreign minister, and the Polish foreign minister, Sikorski. The sixth principle, reconciliation entails the building of governmental and societal institutions that confer equality of rights and responsibilities, even if there is not symmetry structurally. There are Polish, German, non-governmental institutions in every sector of society, from youth exchange to town twinnings, from culture to economics, any element of society you could identify, there will be a relationship between the two countries. And talking about society, we should note public opinion, a survey by the Pew Center, spring of 2017, 69% of polls saw Germany in a positive light. Governmental institutions are also pervasive, a joint customs and police office, an environmental council, a council for cross-border cooperation. Defense and economics are very important elements of structured relations because it's through them that one can see that war is no longer possible. These quiet and deep bureaucratic connections are crucial to maintain continuity when there are difficulties at the top level. Again, we must always look down to what's happening beneath the surface. The height of institutionalization is the annual joint cabinet consultations when almost all of the cabinet on the two sides come together for stock-taking, for creating a new agenda of relations. The seventh principle, and this is the key one perhaps, and one where some of us might disagree. Seventh principle, history, and especially difficult history, cannot be a mere footnote in relations, but rather must act as a constant companion to a newly structured relationship that is different from the past fundamentally. Confrontation with history is undertaken in a variety of institutions, like the German Historical Institute in Warsaw, the Bilateral Textbook Commission, the joint textbook that Poland and Germany have come up with, a book that is used in schools. The goal is not the sanitization or whitewashing of history, but rather to agree on some irreducible facts and the reduction, not the disappearance, of differences. Symbolic events are also an indication of willingness to commemorate the past, and I could recount dozens of them to you, but let me just give you a few examples. The 1970 iconic genuflection of Willy Brandt in Warsaw, everyone knows that. Also the 1989 joint religious mass between Chancellor Kohl and Prime Minister Mazowiecki. And then more recently, President Gauck's speech in 2014 for the 75th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II on Polish soil. There are also tough historical debates, such as over reparations, restitution, expulsion from the territory that became Poland after World War II. And people don't shy away from the debates, they engage in the debates. The eighth principle, reconciliation needs a regional organization to buttress bilateral partnerships. And here, quite simply, I mean Germany's successful advocacy of Polish membership in NATO and the European Union. It's not at all clear that that wouldn't have happened if Germany hadn't been the advocate, the torchbearer for Poland. The ninth principle, a supportive international environment aids the development of international reconciliation. Here we see the US as a positive force encouraging German-Polish reconciliation. We see the Soviet Union before 1989 as a force hindering German-Polish ties. The 10th principle, and this also may be the most important together with history, reconciliation depends on the commitment of young people. Youth exchange is critical. Since 1991, 2.5 million young Germans and young Polish people have been engaged in youth exchange. With the goal of understanding differences, the goal is not to love one another. The goal is to understand differences. There are problems today where language learning, the learning of the German language in Poland far outstrips the learning of Polish in Germany, but these are issues that can be dealt with. Another thing that has to happen is that bilateral institutions have to revise their goals so they have relevance for young people in the 21st century. The goals of my generation in reconciliation are not the same as the goals of young people today. And I would suggest that engaging young people is especially important today when the witness generation, those who experienced directly World War II and the Holocaust, that generation is quickly disappearing. So education of the next generation becomes absolutely critical. And we have to involve that generation on the basis of responsibility. Von Weizsäcker was referred to by the keynote speaker. He very famously said, it's responsibility that we're talking about, not for young people on the basis of guilt. They weren't there, they didn't perpetrate the crimes. They're responsible as members of the German polity, but they're not guilty. I have great hope in young people from all the work I do with young people, so I'd like to leave you with that thought. My hope is indeed for young people who can carry on the efforts at reconciliation between Germany and Poland. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Feldman. それでは次に東京大学の
So now may I call on Professor Kubo of the University of Tokyo. Thank you very much indeed, and I would like to express my appreciation for you to invite me to the symposium. And so I would like to take up the case of Japan and U.S. historical reconciliation. I have distributed my resume, and if you wish, please refer to this resume while listening to my talk. So, is true reconciliation possible? This is a question that is often asked by many historians. I think this is quite difficult because if there is reconciliation over history, there probably would be a product of compromise or partial or incomplete. This is something that we have to first of all accept. I think between Japan and the United States, reconciliation worked out pretty well, but this does not mean that it is perfect. It is imperfect and partial. And the direct victims and the family members would, I think it is quite natural for them to be angry forever. And so the victimizers would have to really pay respect to the feelings of these people. Of course, there are some episodes that tell us that these people had shown forgiveness. But generally speaking, we have to accept the fact that the victims would really keep holding grudges. Now, there are those who need to be forgiven and those that need to forgive. There are two parties involved. And is it possible for the two parties or the country and the victims to seek a point of compromise? And if this is supported especially by the civilian society and the NGOs, it would be relatively easy to lead to an agreement. Now, sometimes compared to Germany, Japan is criticized of not expressing clear apologies. If I Google with the keyword Japan and apology, I would have about 50 hits. And these are one or two of the war apology statements that I get on the Google search. And there are so many apologies that are expressed by the Japanese politicians. And sometimes Japan is criticized as going back to the 1930s to try to become a military power once again. But the path that Japan followed since World War II, Japan is a total pacifist country, and collective self-defense rights in most countries were to be explicitly exercised, but this until recently was a major controversy, and the defense spending is still below 1% of the GDP. And in 1991, for the first time, the Japanese self-defense forces was dispatched abroad to the Persian Gulf, whereas in 1950s or 1960s, the British or the French colonies existed. So the trajectory of Japan is quite different from the Western countries, and there are differences in the public opinion. When Japan had been the victim of aggression, are you willing to really stage war? And many countries in the world say 50 or 60% of the people would stand up and fight, but in Japan it was only about 10% of the Japanese. Now, as you are all aware of, in terms of how we interpret and recognize history, we still have many problems between China and also Korea. However, for example, countries like Mongolia have a very good friendly relationship with Japan. And just like Germany and Poland, or the United States and the Philippines, or the UK and India, unlike the neighboring countries in Asia, I personally believe that we don't have so much very serious problem that is yet to be resolved. And in 1914, there was this survey carried out in the ASEAN countries, and which country is most reliable was the question posed, and many responders said Japan would be the most reliable country from their perspective. China, Korea, South Korea, and North Korea, I believe that the situation there is quite specific. As mentioned by Dr. Kitaoka, in case of China, there's quite an extent of manipulation by the government, and the political leaders in South Korea would be affected directly by the public opinion, and even if they make a decision, sometimes they would withdraw because of the major backlash in the society. So the political leaders of both sides have to make compromise, as I pointed out in my resume as number 6. And usually this compromise would not be popular within his or her own country, but is the political leader daring enough and has courage to try to persuade the people. And of course, if that is succeeded, then the historical reconciliation can be solidified. Now, between Japan and the United States, it's not a colonial issue, and If Japan was, of course, one of the colonies of the United States, I think the outcome would have been very different. But there had been, for real, those negative feelings against one another, Pearl Harbor, Death March for the Americans, and the Hiroshima A-bomb, and also there were those bombing of the civilian vessels during World War II that hurt the feelings of Japan, several events. But what changed between Japan and the United States? Occupation by the U.S. forces was different from the Soviet occupation in other countries after World War II, and it was quite mild and generous. That was a major factor for this relatively good relationship bilaterally. And as Professor Feldman had mentioned, there is this international context that had this major impact, Cold War and Korean War. When Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution was drafted, there were no such situations in the world. So it was unanticipated. And of course, for Japan, the U.S. had to be their ally, and the changing global situation required Japan to become the ally of the United States. And so from Japan had transformed into a militaristic country to a pacifist democracy, which no longer would be a threat to other countries in the world. And U.S. in the past used to be an isolationist country, but the United States after World War II had tried very hard to abide by the international rule of law. So, U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was concluded in 1951, and the first security treaty was quite biased. Japan had all the obligations that they had to shoulder. But in 1960, the Japanese request had been accepted in part by the United States, and the treaty had been amended. And while the U.S. forces had used Okinawa and the base, the Air Force Base, and others during the Vietnam War, there was this negotiation between Okinawa, or rather Japan and the United States, to return Okinawa. And the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance became stronger after that. And recently, in 2011 March, when there was this major Eastern Japan earthquake and tsunami, the U.S. forces as well as the U.S. civil society had extended major support and donation, which of course was unprecedented. And as a donation amount, it was number 3 that the United States had offered to foreign countries upon natural disaster. And for Japan, the security environment had deteriorated, and as an ally of the country, the United States had become more important, and so the peacekeeping mission of the United Nations is proactively participated by the self-defense forces of Japan, and also there was a decision made by the Japanese politicians to allow the exercise of the collective self-defense rights, which values U.S. as an ally. And as mentioned already, President Obama had visited Hiroshima, and Prime Minister Abe had visited Pearl Harbor. Well, it didn't have to be simultaneous or really over a very short interval, and for some it may have seemed to be a barter. but actually it wasn't. And of course, both leaders did not apologize. And is Hiroshima and Pearl Harbor similar events? No, they're quite different. But in terms of historical reconciliation, at least although it is not a direct major step forward, there had been advancements. And on page 3, Pew Research Center research result is shown, the apologies for World War II and how the people of both countries view the situation. So 29% of the people think that Japan hasn't apologized sufficiently, but 24% have come to think that there is no further apology that is necessary. So about this U.S.-Japanese relationship, sometimes people think as a model the relationship between the United States and United Kingdom being a natural alliance. And of course, between Japan and the United States, we cannot call this alliance a natural alliance, but we have so much difference in terms of race, ethnicity, culture, religion, and history especially. And so two countries with such a different background managed to reconcile, which I believe is something that we can evaluate to a certain extent. As mentioned by many already, we cannot redo history, but the decision to be made and the effort to be made by both parties, it is quite possible to reach, although a partial reconciliation. Of course, there are many in these countries that have negative feelings, so we need to remain humble. But with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. And the final speaker, we would like to ask Mr. Kanehara, Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary, to give his views, please. Thank you very much for the invitation today. After the war, we have had reconciliation with many countries, sometimes smooth and sometimes not. And the assumption is the interests internationally, the financial interests, and also it has to do closely with the identities of each country, and that influences views of history, and it will influence the process of reconciliation. Now, I am not a historian, so I'm going to talk about personal views. In 21st century, the young people in Japan or the older generations, how should we view history? What should be the stance? I would like to talk about my own feelings on this matter. Well, people will look at the future, and to look at the future, they also look at the past, and if there is a common future, there will be a common past, and the reverse is true. If the future changes, the past will also change. So I think that it is history is something that's always living, and we live in 21st century Japan. Where are we standing? What is our view? I think that's very important. In academia, after the war, there was the Marxist historical view, but now going beyond ideology, the young scholars have been able to use the new disclosed materials, and they have free and detailed discussions. That is, the conservative, reformist, old post-war ideologies are now being something of the past, and a new history view is coming. So what should be our viewpoint? In the 20th century, there was chaos in thought and economy and politics and in the military. So the 20th century is like a muddy river which flowed past, and we couldn't catch the entire picture, just the fragments. And that's probably what the Japanese people have felt. There are many recollections, but very few which captures the entire image. Fortunately, we can use the lessons of the 20th century and the 21st century. And in the end of the 18th century, there was the Industrial Revolution in the UK, which brought about dramatic changes in the world. There was distortions and resentment. And from 19th century to the first half of 20th century, there was confusion and series of bloodsheds. And at this time, if we look back on history, I would say that it was probably one of the most savage times in history. Social disparity, communist revolution, racial discrimination, colonization, Great Depression, bloc economy, world wars of independence, developmental dictatorship was seen. However, in the 20th century, for the restoration of justice and human dignity, a restoring force appeared. And so, gradually, we saw the new world order. And the biggest force in the 20th century was trying to, there were various forces trying to eliminate disparities, but the biggest force, I would say, is the ethnic self-determination in Asia, Africa, and also the propagation of democracy and liberty. And that's on the flip side of the elimination of racial discrimination. In other words, there was the generalization of universalization of Western values. After World War II, there was the move for independence by the colonies, so that by the end of the 60s, excluding a few countries, there was independence seen in Asia and Africa. And what needs special mention is Mahatma Gandhi, who did not use force. And he had a love for humankind based on Hindu philanthropy. And we acknowledge that you cannot rule people's hearts just with force. In other words, people are essentially free and equal, and that is not just in Western Enlightenment. Power is not for power, but rather it is to serve people's well-being. That idea is not just present in the West. In other words, there is at the roots a deep love for mankind behind the liberty, human rights, and democratic beliefs. And so Gandhi said that these Western values should be Western values, and if that is the case, then colonial rule is a vice. And if you read about this, Gandhi and Tolstoy, and with those words, he maintains nonviolence, and in 1947, India achieves independence. It is one of the major events in this time. And also, we cannot forget the civil rights movement in the United States, that is in the South, in Alabama. An African-American elderly woman was sitting on a bus, and she was told by a white to give up the seat because it's not where the black people should sit. And she refused openly. And after that time, the racial discrimination sponsored by the state sees the demise. Before that, it is the UK. Before it is ruling India, it was an empire in the Caribbean, and the slavery system and plantations were brought in, and there was deep-seated racial discrimination. And at this time, we saw the death of this racial discrimination because there was the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King, and his words shook the people's hearts. And in 1963, he said, "I had a dream," and he was able to fill the huge mall. And there were also so many people in Constitution Avenue and Independence Avenue too. And if you read King's works, you can find the influence of Gandhi. And interestingly, what Tolstoy talks about is the words of the black liberators, and Tolstoy influenced Gandhi, and then Gandhi influenced King. So I think that this is highly interesting. And the U.S. had this philosophy at the time, and transcending border, continents, race, culture, and religion, it became a universal value which could guide the world. And in many countries, discrimination was eliminated. Mr. Mandela in South Africa, and President Mandela, he did use weapons, but then finally his resistance made a difference. And so the Western values, it's not just the Christian Western world values, there was universalization, and I think that this was an opportunity which led to the universalization of democracy being a universal value. And taking 1 century, this was a slow trend. And interestingly, the Asian African countries at one time are autocratic, and India is the exception. But other countries that became independent, they wanted to become strong very quickly. So there was developmental dictatorship or the communist dictatorship. And this ends after the 1990s. And in 86 in the Philippines, there is the Democratic Revolution, which is the first in Asia. And according to the Filipinos, they say it happened recently, but we don't remember the democratization of the Philippines, first in Asia. And then in 87, we have Korea also democratizing. And then after that, Taiwan and various other ASEAN countries in Asia realizes democratization. So taking this democratization taking root, there is a close relationship with the expansion of the middle classes. And we look at Japanese standards or the standards in Europe and the US, and maybe we could criticize the young democracies, but I think that's not fair, because clearly they believe in democracy, and former Indonesian President Yudhoyono and former Philippine President Mr. Aquino are very proud of their democracy and have affection for democracy. Unfortunately, in China in 1809, at the time of the Tiananmen incident, the path to democracy is severed. And there is a movie that cannot be shown in China, but you see university students, and they are similar to the students in Japan in the 60s. They are very free, and that was severed. And from there, China's democratization is not seen. So if we look back right now, the viewpoint to look at history becomes clear. And what became clear after the Cold War is that there is the liberal global order led by the U.S., which is expanding all over the world. And then there is a lot of Asian and African countries democratizing and participating. And whether we can continue to support this order with them, that is on a global basis, will be the challenge for us going forward. And we live in this day, and therefore we need to gain the lessons of history with the values that we uphold, that is liberty, equality, and democracy, which are universal values. And these are not just translated words from English. There is what Gandhi believed in, that is love for people, or the respect for human dignity, and these are very deep convictions, and that transcends the color of one's skin or eyes or race or culture or political beliefs or religion or borders or time, and it is seen throughout mankind. And there have been various religions since ancient times, or various philosophies, and if you think about what that philosophy is, it's difficult to put into words, but I think it can be called perhaps conscience. And Tolstoy says that God is love. And Confucius said that good is love, and Tolstoy said that we should not have fear, and these kinds of universal values and the assumptions behind them is, I think, feelings that are held by mankind, and it was awakened. I think it is. We are seeing an awakening of these feelings, and there was the war, there was massacres, there was racial discrimination, there was the developmental dictatorship, and we should not hold fear, and we should learn the lessons in the 21st century. And also we know the universal principles for the 21st century, which is liberty, equality, and democracy, and at its roots is the unwavering conviction towards the human dignity and the deep love for mankind. And I think that should be the perspective when we look back on the history on the 20th century. This is not just for the Japanese people, rather the many Asian and African countries which are going to gain power. They want to regain the history that had been erased, and they will write their own history, and they will have to rebuild their own identities. And there was the lines that was drawn by the coloners, and that led to this appearance of national identities or people's identities, or there could have been a regional identity in the past which had been divided. And compared to the universal values that is going to be passed on, and I think that will lead to the global history. And this global history, well, it is being taken up by U.S. globalism, but also in Europe, and the historians, they also have a deep understanding of history. Global history, I think, is going to be written more and more, and on such an occasion, the Japanese people, we have done research after the Meiji period of the U.S. and Europe, but we don't know Asia that much, and therefore we need to study Asia, what kind of history Asia wants to write, and how we are to face history. Thank you very much.
We have heard from 4 panelists, each presentation from a different perspective, a different point of view. We still have some time left, not much, but among the panelists, if there are some comments or questions you'd like to make to other panelists, this is the time. So, anyone? First? If I may use the prerogative of the moderator, and if I may ask one question to Professor Celani. In case of India, vis-a-vis the United Kingdom, the India did not demand apology or reparation from the United Kingdom, and Professor Celani mentioned that India was already under a pure democracy at that time. Well, under the democracy, I'm sure there were various diversified discussions and views because you were in democracy. And you mentioned that because India was a democratic state, you did not demand the apology or reparation. But what about the diversified views or different views held in the society then? From the early time in India, have there been a group demanding for reparations, compensation, and apology of United Kingdom in India at the time?
Question, and in India, being a open society, there's always diversity of views. In fact, if you get 5 Indians, you get 6 views. So there was obviously a constituency in India that, you can call it the nationalist constituency, which had a very different viewpoint. And in fact, that constituency was affiliated with the Indian National Army that was in turn led by Subhash Bose, who had a relationship with Japan, and the nationalist movement had a very different approach to India's independence struggle. They differed with Mahatma Gandhi on the methods to be employed to gain independence. So even before India gained independence, there was a divergence of opinion among those struggling for Indian independence. But I think one factor that played a role in India's moderate stance vis-a-vis Britain is the fact that India's independence came not through a revolution. Many countries have experienced revolutions, like China did, right? There was a bloody revolution. China was born in blood, essentially, and therefore you saw the consequence of that in China. For a number of years thereafter, China internally was torn, and there was a lot of bloodletting. The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. So there were these horrendous domestic upheavals that left millions of Chinese dead. India's independence came through an evolutionary process. And ironically, the party that led India to independence was a party that had been created decades before India gained independence. And that same party ruled India for a few decades after India became independent. So this kind of an evolutionary process that led to India's independence, despite the divergence of opinion and despite the nationalist lobby within India, helped to create a more tolerant view of the imperial ravages that India suffered. But if I could make one point in general, of the discussions that we had in this panel, and which struck me, normally it is often said that time would heal historical wounds. But actually, when you look at Asia, the reverse is happening. And I'm concerned about that, because during the Cold War period, the Cold War between the East and the West, the ghosts of history were lying buried. And when the Cold War ended, and as Asia rose economically, also a sense of confidence emerged in Asia, and then suddenly the ghosts of history have been resurrected. So we are seeing something very unusual, that time is not the healer in Asia. And that raises some fundamental issues about how history has become a tool of dirty geopolitics. And unless we do not understand how history is being used in a negative manner, we will not be able to deal with this history issue, because the history issue now weighs down all major bilateral relationships in Asia. And unless the history issue is resolved, Asia will not be able to acquire the status and the power to shape the new international order.
Thank you. I have one small question to Dr. Feldman about the recent political development in Germany. Of course, the AfD gained only 12% of the total votes, but they have about 90 seats in the Bundestag. How this would affect or would not affect the sort of historical relation, the reconciliation and the memory of history between Germany and some countries surrounding Germany, particularly Poland.
On the Polish question, there is a meeting of minds in some senses between the Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, and the governing party in Poland, because they're both anti-immigrant parties. The question becomes, what other things how do they develop as a party? We don't know a lot about them. Their agenda seems quite narrow, negative, but narrow at the moment. For me, the key question is, first, will there be an effective coalition? And those negotiations are going to be very difficult. And then can that coalition work together with the main opposition, namely the Social Democratic Party, to contain this party? It's not the first time that neo-Nazi sentiments have been expressed in the mainstream. We've had neo-Nazi parties in the state parliaments in Germany before, but it is the first time at the federal level and in the mainstream. So we have to watch this with concern. But it's not as if there haven't been other examples of xenophobia in the past, including in government officials. So it's not an entirely new problem, but it does have some new dimensions.
Please.
I have a question, if I may, for Dr. Chelani and for Professor Kubo. In Japanese-US reconciliation and in UK-Indian reconciliation, have you seen a role for civil society groups in either of these areas of reconciliation?
So, Professor Kubo, yes, thank you for the question. Well, when it comes to the U.S.-Japanese relationship, the economic system as well as democracy is quite mature, and cultural exchange, especially among professionals and experts, are quite extensive. And the former military officers also have interaction between the two countries. Those who fought against each other had reconciled to a greater extent through these civilian and military exchange. And I think in both countries there are a large group of people who want to promote this good relationship. It's not just on the government level. Japan and the United States, of course, is an ally, so there is this relationship between the U.S. forces and the Japanese self-defense forces, supported by the NGOs and the civilian society. And I think what was very interesting that was mentioned by Mr. Chelani was time cannot heal. Well, when we think about the relationship with South Korea, I have to admit that the relationship have deteriorated in the recent years, and thus would our suffering and pain be healed by time? Not necessarily, I agree. And especially between Korea and Japan, maybe when the country was not fully democratic, it was easier to try to seek a solution and reach an agreement. And what was very interesting, mentioned by Mr. Chelani, was the United Kingdom had expressed their apologies. So was it also better for Japan not to apologize? Well, as an outcome, I believe that it was better for Japan to apologize. But I think to be objective as a case, a historical case, we need to be fully aware. Jennifer Lind, in her book Sorry State, the apology expression do not necessarily generate an expected outcome, which of course does not justify non-apology. But you're not really guaranteed that if you apologize, that would be that the opponent would forgive you. Do you have any further question from the panelists? Well, we've totally run out of time, but we would like to open the floor for questions or comments from the floor. And please be very brief and succinct if you want to ask a question. And my name is Yoshida from JIIA. I'm an individual member, and I have two questions to Professor Feldman. Between Germany and Poland, the reconciliation. Historically, Poland has been is located between Russia and Germany, and so in the background of this reconciliation between Germany and Poland, was there a factor in the minds of Poland that they want to evade this great pressure that is exerted by Russia? So was there a Russian factor involved in the reconciliation? And the second question is, if Poland had a population of about 10 times that of Germany, that they had nuclear weapons, and that they had this autocratic government, do you think that they still satisfy the 10 principles, and do you think that they still reconciled? So this is a hypothetical question, but that's my second question.
On the first question, I think clearly before 1989, Russia was an impediment to German-Polish relations. It's very clear. After 1989, it's a difficult situation, and there are some differences between Germany and Poland over Russia, with Poland being much more hardline, much more cautious, very concerned about Russian intentions, and Germany wanting more to dialogue and to negotiate. So there are some tensions in those relations, but I think the Russia factor is the physical presence of Russia so near is a very, very important question for Poland. It has been historically, and it continues to be, whereas the other part of that equation, historically, Germany, that relationship is relatively stable. And I don't know about if Poland had been, I think it's an impossible question. I can't imagine Poland bigger and with nuclear weapons. And of course, Germany doesn't have nuclear weapons because part of Germany's process of reconciliation was to forego having ABC weapons. So I'm sorry, but I don't have the imagination to come up with an answer for you.
あと1、2問。どうぞ。
One or two more questions?
Person at the back.
Robert von Rimscher, I'm minister at the German embassy, and out of partial knowledge, let me just say one sentence to the question that was just asked on German-Polish reconciliation and the Russian role in it, or not the Russian role in it, the relationship of this reconciliation process to Russia. There has been a process initiated, if I remember correctly, 2008 or 2009, a trilateral process involving Russia, Poland, and Germany. And that process started with historians' conferences, led to exhibits on historical topics, had a youth element, span into civil society get-togethers, and culminated in foreign ministers meeting in this trilateral format, Russia, Poland, Germany. So there has been quite a bit of very active work on that front. The one comment I wanted to make is the following. I very much agree with the 10 principles of reconciliation that were laid out, and I think they hold up not only when it comes to the German-Polish reconciliation process, they're pretty close to being also an accurate description of the core elements of other reconciliation processes we've seen in Europe. If I look at the Franco-German reconciliation, the relationship Germany today has with the Netherlands, with Israel, you can almost go down this list and identify core elements that apply to all of these reconciliation processes. Namely, the most important ones, civil society involvement, and really honest addressing of historical issues, the institutionalization not only on the state level but also in civil society. So I think these 10 principles very much hold true as a description for other reconciliation processes as well. And I believe you can narrow them down somehow, condense them. This is me speaking personally, not the German government. If I look at European, specifically German reconciliation processes after World War II, I think the two quintessential prerequisites and elements have been one, the honest, and that takes a lot of time, deeply rooted, not only political but also societal willingness to address the past as it was, which is an ongoing process, lengthy, messy, non-linear, non-even, sometimes painful, and certainly does not happen ad hoc. It's a generational project. In the case of Germany, it took at least one generation. But this seems to me to be the one prerequisite, and the second one, an extended hand and the willingness to reconcile on the part of former victims. It was correctly pointed out that oftentimes the initiative, as was the case with the Polish bishops, that oftentimes the initiative doesn't necessarily start with the perpetrator, but can often start with the victims. I believe the willingness to forego the instrumentalization of history and instead to honestly embark on a course of reconciliation, the willingness for that, in my reading, would be the second core prerequisite for all such processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 他に
Other questions? Yes. Shikara from Mitsui. Mitsui, sorry. And I'd like to ask some of the panelists. I was in Singapore in the 1990s, and even now in Singapore, there is people who bear hatred against the Japanese. And when I was there, I did not, however, feel unpleasant, and the reason is that between Singapore and Japan, there was a mutual relationship of economic dependence, which was getting deeper. And especially in the 1970s, Prime Minister Fukuda at that time and Minister Lee Kuan Yew had an agreement about the petrochemical project, which was launched, and it has developed now, and Singapore is now a hub of Asia-Pacific where Japanese corporations can be active, and we can contribute to the employment there. So this kind of development of economic relationship, I think that has led to the reconciliation of Japan and Southeast Asian countries. If someone could comment on this, I would be very appreciative. I see Mr. Takeyachi, ambassador to Singapore, so it's a bit difficult for me to speak. But when I speak with Singaporeans, I'm often told, never forget, but forgive. In other words, we cannot forget what happened, but there can be forgiveness. And I think there is that new relationship between Japan and Singaporeans, and I think that's how they truly feel. We say Asia, but there are areas where a lot of Japanese forces were present, and there were those that did not become battlefields, and I think that may lead to differences in the feelings. And Singapore is a place where the military was pervasive, and well, actually, the UK releases the political prisoners, and several thousands of people were killed, and I think that bears heavy on the Singaporeans' hearts. When becoming independent, there was the San Francisco Peace Treaty, and the reparation with UK had been finished, but special reparations, well, there is economic cooperation, and if we think about the Independence Monument in Singapore, you see the independence and also the condolence to the victims, and half of that money is from Japan, and I think that's a symbol of Japan-Singapore relationship. And as you say, well, there was a big fight with Malaysia at the time of independence, and then Japanese companies made contributions, and they have not forgotten that too. So I think there is that influence too.
If I could just, add to what Kanehara-san has just mentioned, which is that the economic factor is no doubt very important, but not by itself. If it's embedded in a larger matrix of issues that promote reconciliation, then economic codependency can help facilitate reconciliation and rapprochement. But by itself, it doesn't really help. To give you two examples, look at the Japan-China relationship or the China-India relationship. Economically booming, both relationships, right? And just this summer, for 10 weeks, China every day was threatening India to teach a lesson. Every day there was a threat of war or a statement that India will be taught a lesson. It went on for 10 weeks continuously, even though China right now enjoys a $60 billion trade surplus with India. If there's one aspect of the bilateral relationship that has boomed between China and India, it's the trade relationship. And yet, you saw the opposite. So I would say that, yes, what you say is very right, but it has to be embedded in a larger matrix of issues that are promoting reconciliation. And in the case of China and India, it's not even pre-World War II history. It's post-World War II history, because China and India historically were not neighbors. They became neighbors only after China annexed the Tibetan Plateau, which was in 1950-51. So we're talking of more recent history. And here we are seeing history, more recent history, becoming an impediment to a bilateral relationship that is booming economically.
I have to apologize for running over time this morning, but this was the first session of the symposium to kick off the productive discussion, so I think it was worthwhile. I would like to thank all the panelists for their major contribution. President Nogami, thank you very much, and all the panelists are to be appreciated. The second session is to get started at 1 o'clock. And please leave your simultaneous interpretation receiver on your seats.